So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Saved Uzumaki Clan. So let's start the series. The Yandeme's ability to immediately identify Ghost Aiha as a threat, recognize the notorious red and black style of the Mangekyo Red Eye power, and warp back to headquarters to warn the people they're in a single description of Mangekyo. Before returning to Ghost Uchiha's side before the mystery man even moved spoke volumes about his godlike abilities at the time of the confrontation. The Yondaime had long since mastered the art of ignoring real spatial constraints. Even though they were angry and upset, the shinobi forces had little trouble piecing together the events of a terrible night. The Nine Beast attack was a historic occurrence, and Aiha Ghost Aiha was held accountable. The shinobi of the village knew how Jinchuriki worked and how sealing worked as well, albeit only conceptually. They also knew that they had to protect the last Uzumaki of the village because their bloodline was the only thing that could hold the powerful Nine Beast in check, especially if the Mangekyo lurked outside of Hyde Ninja Village's control. In this way, hatred was heaped on both Ghost Aiha and Nine Beast. Unfortunately, Murda's social life and his need for affection and care were not greatly aided by the presence of both apparent and invisible guardians. Neither did the false beliefs of naive and misinformed citizens, who desired to hate. Ghost Aiha and Nine Beast were both at fault, and one person was present. Did it really care that it would not hear and that a boy would have to deliver the message in its place? They were allowed to grieve whatever they pleased because they had lost so much. Regarding the hatred of civilians, Murdo stated that he was very sympathetic. A civilian went off in rage. That day, a friend of his exploded to defend himself. Do you have any idea what this kid means to our village? His existence protects us in its own way. Don't you get that the Nine Beast doesn't die? That he can only be sealed in a Jinchuriki? What do you think would happen if we lose the last Uzumaki? The Nine Beast would be released, and who'll seal him? And what is going to hold him, when there are no more Uzumaki to handle it? Do you think it's anything like the other Biju? It's not. You have no idea. It's not your job to have any idea, so stop it. Leave it to us professionals to explain to you what will keep you safe. That's our job. No, Murdo replied. He has a point. The Nine Beasts should die. It ruined his family, mine too. And then the man looked up into his hooded, resentful eyes and said, the Nine Beast, stupid fox, and the Ghost Aiha, they ruined my life. They took everything from me, my mother, my father, and they even took my place among you all. Young Murdo gestured to the man and everyone behind him on the street. So okay. Let's hate them together. And if you ever find a good way to kill either one, then I want to be the first to know. Murdo said. Astonished, the man remained silent for a few seconds. He nodded, realizing that he was completely in accord with the youngster and that his own face was reflected in the child's iris. He realized that he had made a mistake and that they should despise Nine Beasts together. As clans went, his clan's presence in Hyde Ninja Village in Gakure wasn't particularly wealthy, and neither was its membership large. The clan had primarily resided in Uzashigakure prior to it, and they had been destroyed by war. However, some of them, including his mother, had remained in Hyde Ninja Village, and their combined resources had nowhere else to go but Nerda's personal bank account. It was a meager comfort. He had no family. However, he did have a legacy, as well as a collection of teaching scrolls that were intended to be passed on and preserve the wisdom of his predecessors. He held on to that. Seals, 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 they murmured. The language of the gods. Not exactly, they responded. But there are significant differences. It was difficult to see past their faces, whether they were severe, friendly, or joyful, but there was a certain brightness and a sense of pride in their eyes. Murdo tried his best to listen to them. Murdo wanted to believe that the pride was for him, the following generation. He refused to disappoint the photos. For the price of ink, paper, and a little of our time, we will seal an image and a voice, and you will have a running movie of lessons. The people in the scrolls stated that the written word is a subpar medium, which is respectable but superfluous for something this significant. They said, this is what we do. This is what makes the world respect and fear us. This is why these scrolls are so important. This is why we must preserve our culture and our knowledge in this way. Seals will likely bring the world down on us and scatter us to the winds, but that is not the fault of the art. We cannot give up on the art because seals are what we are, what we all are. Our clan is doomed. But we are happy because we can look at the world and truly understand the forces that make it work. In comparison, being truly aware of the world and ourselves is more important than being able to twist those forces, which is why we cannot give up. Don't you see, youngster, it's beautiful. Have you noticed yet? It's a gift from our generation to yours, so don't delay and check it out. In terms of beauty, he thought Auntie Haruka was lovely and kind. It was also nice that she always seemed to have cookies baking in the background of her lessons, and he would have liked to try those cookies as well. Murdo tried to see, played the lessons repeatedly, and heard the words, but his thoughts were on the pictures. However, the world, he was unable to see it. On one occasion, he noticed that he was practicing writing the word gather in seal language on the ground. He was using leaves as the target because it seemed like the ideal method to tidy up his large courtyard, and he was quite small in contrast. However, he had trouble remembering the meaning of the seal while he was charging it. Gather wasn't the most straightforward. Warm was. However, Murdo preferred gather since it featured large, flowing lines and was simpler to draw without making a mistake. In order to charge a seal, it must either have a guide section that allows the core energy to flow directly through the lines, or the charger must comprehend the meaning of the seal. In the case of gather, Murdo had to recall that the first stroke stood for everything, which is why it was outside the others. The second stroke stood for identity, which is why the leaf was placed there, and the third stroke, which was close to the second but not quite touching, represented the tendency for things to move in the same direction. However, he had to remember that it wasn't gravity, specifically, but rather like water that cling to form a larger bubble, or birds choosing to sit together on a line on his roof. Additionally, order was crucial. The world comes first, followed by things, and then laws for things. Additionally, there were explanations for why it was that way this time around, and Murdo needed to remember those explanations as well, or else the seal wouldn't charge. It was challenging. But one day he did, and the leaves began to gather. It was slow, of course, and at first he assumed it was simply the wind rustling the leaves, but after a while the leaves of his courtyard gathered dutifully in his circle, and Murdo was overpowered. Despite the fact that he had performed some sort of miraculous wizardry, he picked up a leaf from the pile and dropped it far away. He watched in awe as it slowly made its way towards the others. It appeared to be alive and mystical, and he suddenly realized that he truly understood how the magic worked. Since this understanding was required to charge the seal, he had to comprehend it, but he discovered that this did not lessen its specialness. He then thought that seals were a way to manipulate laws that already existed. He then looked to the perimeter of his property and went on a walk. There were numerous trees and leaves outside, and he knew that there was a piece of the magic he had witnessed somewhere in each of them. Additionally, every single rock, human, bird in the sky, and dust particle, the entire planet was one vast work of spirit art, accomplishing a million tasks simultaneously, all with a purpose, all with tenderness, all in uniformity, and appearing beautiful and complex from a distance and quite simple when viewed up close. It was incredible, and he felt humbled as he glanced up at that point. He had a place, and it was exactly where it was in this lovely thing, and he felt special as he gazed at the world at that moment. And Murdo expressed gratitude, whispering through tears, "That's an awesome present. Sorry it took so long to unwrap," he said. One day, Murdo discovered something incredible. It seems that there was a seal specifically for Uzumaki, and if an Uzumaki put their blood on it, it would demonstrate that the person who donated the blood was a real Uzumaki. At the time, his first thought was that it was completely useless, but since it was a seal for him and his family, Murdo did his best to master it. In terms of sealing, it was also fairly simple. In any case, one day while eating breakfast with toast hanging from his mouth and feet kicking beneath the table, Murdo made the decision to write it down on paper. He drew the seal because sketching was meant to be a good exercise, but he did it purely for fun. However, Murdo discovered something incredible when he charged the seal. Suddenly, the floorboard beneath his chair flew up, knocking him to the ground. Then a second floorboard appeared, followed by another. Before long, Murdo was looking at a huge safe in place of his floor, with wood everywhere in a state of disarray. But since Murdo was the kind of boy, he couldn't truly say he didn't mind a mess. Instead, he looked at the safe, which was large, gray, and made of metal, and it took up the area where he usually ate all of his meals. Well, Murdo was staring at the safes combination when he decided to attempt the 0-0-0 combination and test if it worked. However, something on the dial cut his finger. Murdo sucked his finger sullenly while he gazed at the safe, angry at this cruel animal that had taken over his dining area and then had the audacity to attack him. But then it opened, and instead of swinging wide, it moved sideways like a sliding door, sending Murdo plummeting through a pitch-black tunnel beneath his house. Before he hit the bottom of his tumble on a trampoline of all things, he let out an unabashed scream. Naruto noticed a table off to the side with 2 scrolls and a lamp on it as the walls came to life with the flare of ink seals. One large, one tiny. The small one resembled one of those movie scrolls, but the large one was quite massive. Thus, it is evident that Naruto opened the smaller one first. Naruto assumed it was another movie seal. It seemed very familiar. Normally, he couldn't charge them since he didn't understand how they worked, but he saw that it had an author guide inscribed into it, just like the other movies he had been given. Additionally, his mother was stunning. Naruto yelled as he leapt out of the hole and onto his wooden floor. It wasn't your typical trampoline. One of his onlookers said, "Naruto, I came in after hearing you yell. Are you okay?" "What? Yeah, there were some seals down there, another movie seal, but of my parents." Naruto wiped his eyes. They were dry, of course, but he felt the need to verify. There was some trip they had taken and they were going to edit the seal before they added it to their library. And that's why it was down there. I think it was some kind of secret study. And that's why it didn't get destroyed with everything else in their house that night. It appeared that this house was kept inside the tiny Uzumaki compound, which had been his mother's home before the marriage. There were tools and privacy seals here that were not to be taken lightly, so there had been a safe house like that. His parents had gotten married and had moved there together. Naruto couldn't believe how much he must have lost when he lost his parents' home to the 9 beasts. He believed his parents were the type of people who had a ton of picture albums and sealed memories. However, this video at least made it through, and the larger scroll, whatever it was, he was overjoyed to have discovered it. "Hey," Naruto said, "if you knew I fell down, why didn't you come after me? Isn't that your job?" "No." "Well," the man with the boar mask replied, "I saw all the seals that lined the whole walls and I'm not crazy enough to test the seals in an Uzumaki's own home." Naruto thought he could comprehend that. Naruto performed okay at school. He didn't perform very well, but he also didn't perform particularly poorly. The majority of his time at home was spent with his scrolls, which didn't actually address Tai or nin spirit art or anything similar. His scrolls contained a few motions that resembled Tai spirit art, but they weren't true katas or styles. Rather, they were discrete techniques and movements that might be utilized specifically to position oneself well to write on the opponent's back or chest or to sneak away undetected. However, none of that resulted in a better score for Tai spirit art. Additionally, explosive tags were the only seals used in the curriculum, and those weren't used for another 2 years. Naruto had always been more concerned with his heritage and had never been particularly upset by it. However, he discovered a segment in which his parents discussed the destiny of their unborn child. His father had expressed his confidence that his kid would excel academically and grow up to be a great and honorable shinobi. He also hoped that his son would carry on his father's original methods. His mother had reprimanded his father, stating that as long as he was happy with his life, he didn't need to be a ninja, receive A's, or anything else. She would be satisfied if he had a wife who loved him, friends, and a family, and was a good young man. His father sheepishly agreed, but Naruto wasn't sure if he had received a true reprimand. He believed his father still wanted his son to succeed in school, so he made the decision to follow the instructions both of his parents had given him. He had no luck when it came to dating girls. He thought Sakura from his class was attractive, and her pink hair reminded him of the red that many of the women in his clan scrolls wore. Dating her seemed appropriate in some way, and she was also vivacious and kind, and she most likely had fewer cuties than the other girls. Girls were still very repulsive to Naruto at this stage of his life, but he would do his hardest for his mother. However, Sakura turned him down, saying he wasn't her type. Naruto inquired about her type and what it would take to be the kind. Since that was Naruto's perception of the world, he thought he could get from point A to point B on his own. After all, if his own efforts had allowed him to see the boundless beauty of creation itself, he could definitely do anything, and he would get from point A to point B even if it took him 100 years. However, it would be nice to know how much work he was in for. Sakura stumbled and then apologized, saying that even while she respected and understood the Jinchurika's duty, it was simply too much to ask her to hug or kiss someone who had a demon inside of them. It was frightening, she said. Therefore, she advised them not to date. Furthermore, she was, after all, a Naruto friend-kun type of girl. They were the last of their clan in the village, but there might be survivors outside. There may be other Uzumaki still living scattered around the world, And in the case of the Aiha, there was undoubtedly at least one more Aiha out there as well, because Ghost Aiha had once again struck this town and attempted to wipe out his own clan. Like Naruto, his friend had a dark past. What distinguished him from his friend Naruto? Since Naruto's clan had always spoken unity and an aggregate view as a clan in their scrolls, Naruto suspected that his friend would be a little more depressed. They said that it required a village to raise a child and that we are all together in everything, which is the rule. And just when the Aiha were reclaiming their lost territory, they were killed. This was because they had worked so long and diligently in the service of their town to disassociate themselves from the shame of their creator. Since he was the only person Itachi and the rest of the clan were able to save, Naruto's friend was spared. It takes a village, Naruto thought. He also believed that his clan and his might had shared a common belief, given how the Aiha family had united to preserve what they could of the next generation. However, Naruto's friend had lost that, and Ghost Aiha had broken that, just as he had broken so much before. Therefore, no, Naruto did not envy his friend. Instead, he envied all the other students, their home-cooked meals, and their inhabited homes. However, he didn't waste time feeling envious of his Naruto pal. In any case, the fact that Sakura, Ino, and apparently every other girl also admired him was important. His clan had been many and relatively wealthy, and they appreciated that he didn't wear bright colors. As a result, his friend Naruto was now completely loaded, and one day he would sit on a council, and he had a ton of houses, and so on. Since he was far from marriageable age, Naruto made the decision to put the girl thing on hold for the time being. Additionally, it didn't appear that any of the other boys were having any luck with girls either. Well, girls were still fairly a key, so Naruto wasn't sure they were trying. The regular students, it seemed to Naruto, were probably jealous of him and everyone else with family techniques. He offered to teach them some sealing because he believed that the gift of seeing the world's magic was something that he shouldn't hoard too much, but they didn't want it. As for friends, he could make them among the shinobi population. In fact, it was easier to be friends with people who were members of a clan because there seemed to be some sort of social separation between shinobi and clan members. It's impossible, they replied. Only an Uzumaki can get anywhere with its stuff, unless they spend forever like the Hokage and become really old. Everyone knows that. Naruto was unaware of that. The scrolls didn't go into great detail about his bloodline limit yet, and he knew it involved energy and possibly chains, but not much else. He had never imagined that his family was the only one that could pick up seals fast, or that they were the only ones who liked the art enough to give it a serious shot. He wasn't persuaded that he was mistaken. However, the key was that he got along well with his buddies. Thus, all he needed were those A's. Soon after, a written test was offered, and Naruto did his best. If he had previously provided 80% effort, he now gave 200%. However, he was unable to identify what he did not know, and no amount of focus or staring could answer the blank questions. He looked intently at his return test the following day, and the C+ appeared to stare back. He had never before given such things any thought, and he didn't understand why he should learn about world history when there was already so much clan history to learn. However, he desired that, for his dad. Naruto was the first student to stand up as class finished, and he approached the teacher to inquire about the difference between an A- and a C+. It is as far as your procrastination, and as near as your determination, the teacher said after giving this some thought because it was a really insightful question. Naruto guessed, then, it is not that far. Naruto began his assignment. He was aware that the school would hold a freestyle fight rating in a week, and he concluded that it would be an excellent opportunity to submit his initial attempt at earning an A. Similar to sealing, he thought that his initial achievement would enable him to make some sort of breakthrough. He hoped that the school world would then open up to him, just as the natural world had, and that perhaps he would come to enjoy school as much as he did his family's art. However, he had to receive that initial A. In the morning, he worked on his Thai spirit art. He wrote his colleagues' names in class. He went to the library after school to try to make sense of those names, those clans. He then tried writing them rapidly after thinking about how the seals he could employ could help him in combat in the afternoon. He then returned to the hidden spot beneath his table before going to bed, promising his parents that he would make an effort to bring them something to be proud of. For a week, he did this again. Then the day came. He had a healthy breakfast that morning. He then put on a white coat because he believed he resembled his father. He reasoned that he must have looked cool in white, just like his father had. He wrapped it around his waist and fastened some scrolls to a black belt that held them vertically. He arranged it such that the scrolls were behind him for optimal mobility. Wearing white fingerless gloves, he scribbled his most recognizable seal, Gather, on the left and Adhere, a seal he had just learned how to use, on the right. The Gather seal that had opened his eyes to the world so long ago was written on a white cloth headband that he placed on the table in front of him. However, he used a felt pen to write the kanji for courage in lieu of the focal point. At this point, combining kanji and seal language had no special effects. There was typically no overall impact because seals involved the manipulation of natural laws and there was no strong global consensus regarding kanji. However, it was symbolic. Additionally, Murdo valued symbols. Most people who used seals, armed, Murdo started out. This was where it was to start, Murdo thought. The teacher was in the center of the enormous circle of students seated in the school's courtyard. The instructor spoke to everyone and clarified that while there were no restrictions, practice kunai was required. He explained that today's results would have a significant impact on their position on the rankings chart and that Murdo knew that if he came first here, he would only have enough to be first on the chart. The teacher reassured the students that if things got out of control, he would intervene quickly enough to handle it. And to Murdo, that sounded like a day. The name of Murdo was called. Here was where it was to start, he told himself. He and Shino each took a step forward, bowed from opposite sides of the ring, and adopted the same academy stance. This position placed one arm in front of the other, with the distant hand opening in a palm and the closest one gripping in a fist. Murdo didn't want to initiate contact, so he looked his opponent down. I have researched you, Shino stated. I looked your clan up in the library, Murdo confessed as he peered back. Uzumaki-san, I ask you not to kill any of my Kukeiichu. They require a direct line to me, in order to live. If I seal them into paper they'll die. Murdo scowled. Shino said, they are my heritage, with a solemn nod. Murdo winced, but he returned the nod. He considered asking Shino to refrain from using his Kukeiichu, hoping that Shino would accept those conditions. However, this was the first time they would be able to apply their home methods in the classroom. Murdo couldn't ask the other boy to conceal his heritage. He wasn't just here to get a good grade today. He was also here to demonstrate to his peers what the Uzumaki clan was capable of. He couldn't have asked Shino more. Murdo answered, okay, and when he met the other boy's gaze, he had the impression that they had just finished a lengthy chat. Murdo slowly reached up and bit his thumb on the right side. At that moment, Shino flicked his wrist, causing a mist of black to emerge from his sleeves. Girls scrambled away in a manner that was almost, ironically, bug-like as they yelled and broke the circle. Murdo didn't yell, he didn't move quickly, and he didn't even attempt to avoid. Murdo was aware that it would be futile to try to ignore them and that he was running out of time before he could no longer fight. He would, however, have a little more time because he was aware that he had more vitality than most others. Thus, he ran. After running at Shino, he smeared blood from his right thumb onto the identity stroke of the gather on his left glove and clenched his fist. He poured his thoughts and waning energy into the gather, and he felt it activate. He felt blood in his body rush to his left hand, becoming dense there. They had been taught in class that there were methods around the world that collected blood in the palms using arcing chops, which made the hand harder and denser. They discovered that some people accomplished this using their martial art rather than core energy or spirit art. Thus, he would apply the same principle to his own artwork. Murdo stumbled somewhat when he intervened, and Shino, taken aback that Murdo would decide to dash into his swarm, was only able to block by raising his arms in a cross guard. It made no difference. There, Shino stumbled over a sitting Shikamaru after Murdo's iron hard fist and his dashing momentum sent the other boy reeling back, his defenses destroyed. And Murdo was declared the victor since Shino had fallen outside the circle. Murdo sighed with relief and sagged back to his position. The encounter had been brief, but the Kukeiichu were famished little creatures. The tension of the moment, however, had been greater than that. As he gazed at the other boy, he had a sense of certainty that it would all end in a single altercation, and when he charged into the unknown. The game ended in a matter of seconds. It had been quick and conclusive. The instructor pointed out to the students that while some battles took a long time, many had the potential to terminate quickly. Occasionally, two fighters may square off and attempt a final move at the same time, with the winner walking away. But in the end, even if you have the ability to read people's minds or bodies. He looked at Ino and his companion Naruto in this instance. You are still placing a wager since you have no idea how things will turn out. When Ino and a male academy student were called up, the girl attempted to conduct a spirit art performance, which Naruto assumed was likely a variation of her family's spirit art. However, she was extremely slow at it and was defeated by simple Academy Tia spirit art. She had obviously placed the incorrect wager. When Sakura and Naruto friend were called up, Sakura forfeited right away, and Naruto buddy was relieved that he would not have to endure such a conflict. Before their next fight, many students got up and left the circle for cover as wide shots and deflections put them at risk of injury. 2 more students were called up, and they silently agreed to switch to a ranged battle. Practice kunai and shuriken flew over the clearing. This was okay because the circle was depicted by a line drawn on the floor. In the end, one student just ran out of projectiles. The other student, who had carried an extra equipment pouch, brutally tagged him as he knelt down to collect some from the ground. Naruto believed that there was again another poor wager. When Naruto was called up again, Choji was summoned up too. The other youngster wore his green jacket as usual, but he had added a pair of arm grips. They assumed their familiar positions against one another. Naruto thought of the big boy, who might be made fun of for being overweight, but it would work to his advantage in this situation because he had a sumo body and would be difficult to push out of the arena. However, he was slow, so Naruto believed he might be able to avoid and deliver enough close-range damage to make someone resign. Thus, Naruto drew Choji into the conflict. However, the other boy formed a single seal, something Naruto hadn't anticipated. Naruto threw his iron-like fist in alarm and attempted to retreat. It's too late. Bacon no spirit art. Naturally, when Choji's doubling of mass sent him to the ground in a roll, Naruto thought, dazedly. It was clever that Choji had claimed that he couldn't utilize the family method correctly, not that he couldn't use it at all, but that his waist just grew too large, making it difficult for him to roll or maintain proportion. However, Naruto was aware that was more than sufficient. Instant expansion was not far from an explosion itself, and Naruto was aware of the laws of nature. Naruto rolled. The earth and sky abruptly changed positions. His head rang, and his body was beyond his control due to the ridiculous power of heavy weight traveling more than a meter out in less than a second. He charged the adhere on his right glove in desperation, hoping that among all his flailing, he would swiftly anchor onto something. The world and Naruto found himself looking up at a female with soulful gray eyes after his right hand struck the floor and he stopped in a jerking motion that left his right shoulder screaming in pain. The girl said, "Are you?" with a worried expression. Naruto mumbled that he was all right and was fortunate to have stopped where he did. He had nearly exited the circle. However, he was still engaged in combat. Naruto frowned and then stood up, grunting. Naruto turned to face Choji and gasped. The youngster now seemed more like a balloon than a person. He jiggled and floundered, and he was huge. Naruto gazed in a subdued form of wonder. The crowd then burst out laughing. Naruto blinked in response. Choji had been astute. He had placed a poor wager since Naruto had remained in the ring and Choji now appeared helpless and incapable of defending himself. However, it was shrewd, and Naruto had never been struck so severely in his life. And when Ino or Shino placed a poor wager, nobody laughed. Why was it amusing that you were knocked out by what amounted to a near-sonic body slam? Choji flushed and scowled as he focused on removing the spirit art. However, he was still learning and could not just shrink again. Something that was honestly above Naruto's expectations occurred when the other pupils realized it. The jeers started and the laughter doubled. Naruto looked around in confusion. And the taunts got harsher and worse. Stop it, don't say that. My dad is a great ninja. He wrestles sea gods. He stomps armies. He builds sandcastles 500 feet high. It's not funny. No, we don't all wobble around. It's just that I'm still learning. Choji tried to defend Bacon no spirit art. He tried to defend his entire clan. No, his spirit art wasn't useless. His family was too good at things other than getting fat. He wasn't fat, at least not fatter than he needed to be. It's not amusing. Suddenly, Naruto realized that this was true, that he had not been knocked out by Bacon, that he had not imagined up current events, or been subjected to spirit art. And Naruto screamed the simple words, "Stop it," practically yelling. And they did. More than they were afraid or uneasy. They gazed at him in subdued wonder. "Stop it," Naruto said again, in a more normal tone, looking to the group of girls who had been the worst of it. "That is Choji's heritage. That's a gift from all the family that came before him, from one generation to another. They passed it on because they wanted to help their children, and you shouldn't make fun of that, he said, focusing on Sakura's eyes. Sakura turned away and peered down. When the bacon no spirit art had gone off, Murdo looked back and thought about Choji. He knew that he had thrown his left fist in front of him, but it wasn't a proper punch, and he didn't think he had done any damage. He could have attacked Choji's head because, after all, that hadn't expanded and would have been as vulnerable as ever. More so, though, because the other boy appeared to be immobile now. However, Murdo could not allow things to finish that way. This was more than just cheap shots. Yes, it was true that ninjas relied heavily on cheap shots. However, this was more than just ninja. For him and Choji, this was about family, pride, loyalty, and being able to look in the mirror tomorrow without feeling guilty. This would not finish with a hit to the other guy's skull. Instead, it would be strength against strength. Uzumaki to Akimichi, Murdo would let the other child shrink until he was unable to defend it, and if he enlarged again, Murdo would strike the gut. To demonstrate that neither was inferior, rather than to demonstrate which was superior. Indeed, Murdo deduced that Bacon no spirit art appeared to employ the principles of expansion and physical force, and it was essentially a limited explosion. As Choji eventually shrank, Murdo thought, "I'm sorry, father." He reached up to wipe his eyes and gave him a severe, determined expression that Murdo had never seen on his friend before. Perhaps not today. Murdo removed the two gloves from his hands and threw them out of the ring as Choji gradually regained his normal size. He no longer needed the gather because it had been found to contain blood, and he didn't think the iron fist trick would work. The adhere would have been helpful in keeping him in the ring, but it was on his dominant hand and it limited his brushwork. And that was not possible for him. Murdo made the decision to present Choji with his finest Uzumaki work. And he was aware that Choji would give Murdo his best performance as an Akimichi, as if phrases had just flowed between them. Murdo cracked open a tiny inkwell in his left hand after opening his utility pouch and holding his ink brush in his right. Choji changed his position and looked at Murdo while holding his palms out in front of him. Murdo inked his brush and took his own position, looking sideways and intently at the ink brush he was holding pointing at the other boy. Then they charged at one another. Murdo dived beneath Choji's open palm strike to avoid it. Then, he reached up and slashed the uneven pressure jagged stroke onto Choji's chest before rolling away. With a slight distance between them once more, the two stood and gazed. Choji looked down at his shirt and noted the mark with some fear. Murdo slipped forward, a unique Uzumaki maneuver that was low to the ground and abrupt, intended to abruptly breach the enemy's defenses while preserving proper brush stance. Additionally, Murdo cut Choji's chest with the opposite pressure. With a frantic lunge, Choji was able to stop Murdo's left palm as it was about to reach the finished seal, causing the hair on his neck to stand on end. Choji grabbed Murdo's wrist and pulled him till the two lads were nearly touching. In agreement, and Choji noticed that Murdo's face was filled with fear and deference. Murdo grabbed a scroll from behind him. Choji made a fast seal after releasing Murdo's hand. Bacon no spirit art. The second Bacon no spirit art sent Murdo soaring if the first had sent him tumbling. He was only able to stay in the ring because he had already charged the storage scroll behind his back. As soon as it hit the floor, its contents were discharged. And as Murdo crashed backward onto a big ceiling rock, his progress was stopped. Then the world grew dark. As he stood up, trembling, the world came back into focus for Murdo. He thought it was brilliant, pulling him as near as possible before employing the Bacon no spirit art to make it matter. Choji had a basic understanding of the laws of the universe. He knew that the force of expansion was stronger and more concentrated in close proximity. Keeping this in mind, Murdo tried to get his bearings. At the moment, he noticed that Choji was just getting back to his typical size. Therefore, he must have been out for a minute or so. Choji remarked, "I'm glad you're okay." Murdo said, "Yeah," while standing shakily. "Don't worry about it, Choji," he said. "But today you should be kind to your ancestors, and me. I'll be kind to mine." Choji simply tightened his fists, nodded, and began to run from Murdo without responding to this. Murdo simply focused and raised his left hand into a half seal. The warm seal was by no means the strongest or the simplest to draw. Each jagged line had a certain ratio of spikes that needed to be kept constant. But charging from a distance was the simplest. Additionally, the simplest to overcharge. Choji halted his movement and gripped his collar. As though something had exploded inside Choji's green jacket and needed to escape, air seemed to fly out of it, but that wasn't the case. It was just warm air escaping. Choji yelled. If Choji gave up, Naruto would taper back. The lad, however, demonstrated that his body was not as much fat as most people believed. He also had good muscle. Ignoring the hot metal of his jacket zipper, he tore the garment off in a desperate display of power before throwing it to the ground. And it conflagrated there. Choji panted and looked up at Naruto, or at least he attempted to, but Naruto was no longer in front of the rock. The rock was standing by itself, and the kunai struck into it appeared to be another seal that he couldn't make out. The kunai was stabbed into the identity by the seal, which was actually the gather. Since then, Naruto has positioned Choji between himself and the rock. Choji whirled. After throwing a practice kunai, which was blunt, Naruto used a one-handed seal to activate the gather, which caused all of the kunai in the school to suddenly become drawn to a particular rock. The pupils who had gathered struggled to keep their equipment pouches fastened to their trousers. And as if by magic, Naruto's aerial assault accelerated. Choji barely deflected with his arm guards as the kunai's mid-flight acceleration startled him. The kunai spun wide, curved in an odd arc, and flew at the boulder behind Choji. All the Akamichi could do was parry and dodge the lightning-fast kunai throws that were coming at him. He had no time to observe this or to consider. When he attempted to sidestep, Naruto would just toss the kunai in a new arc. It seemed odd. The academy and even his clan never talked about arcing kunai or missiles that appeared to alter their speed in midair. It was unthinkable, and Choji had never considered preparing for it. As he attempted to counter the series of assaults, Choji retreated. Naruto's force was no longer alone, not because he had become any stronger or more adept at throwing kunai. The universe was assisting Naruto in hurling a kunai at Choji. Choji persisted in this circumstance despite the fact that the kunai tips were dull and would cause more bruises than cuts. Like so many times before, he could stop it with a forfeit, but not today. Not right now, and Choji struggled to maintain a composed posture and speech as Naruto dug into his equipment pouch and found nothing, believing that he was at least today embodying over a century of Akamichi pride. He gasped, but it was unavoidable. At least he spoke steadily. "You're out of kunai," Choji clarified. Naruto said calmly, "I'm an Uzumaki," and he unclasped a small scroll behind his back. The little kid twirled and danced it over his palm, bringing it level in front of him with a somewhat distracted demeanor. "I don't ever run out of anything," he said. With those words, he opened a tiny practice kunai arsenal. And like a localized thundercloud of iron and steel, all the small, dull chunks of metal started to drag themselves off the ground and speed into the Akamichi. Choji didn't employ spirit art with Beika. Although the shower of metal struck Choji in the stomach, each one wasn't as vicious as when Naruto threw them. At the time, the kunai had been employing both Naruto's and the seal's force. However, Naruto was about to make amends when Choji noticed the other boy pointing toward him with his hand in a half-seal. Additionally, the kunai somehow increased in force over time. Choji was aware that he could give up. Additionally, he realized that he would much rather give up as the kunai dug deeper into his spirit art-enhanced belly. However, he was unable to. Not right now. Choji clenched his teeth, knowing that although his spirit art would appear ridiculous and be ridiculed, neither his ancestor nor the spirit art were at blame. It belonged to him. He was unable to demonstrate to others how awesome it was to be able to grow larger and more powerful in an instant. However, currently, today, Choji inhaled deeply before sobbing and pouring reserves he was unaware he possessed into Beika without spirit art. And he doubled once more, and using his new girth, he crushed the rock that contained the gather seal as near as he could. The massive kunai in Choji's stomach bounced away between the loss of old force and the explosion of new force. Some flew at the onlookers, while others went over their heads. The majority went back to Naruto. Even yet, Naruto suppressed his shock since there was no time for shock. Time slowed down as adrenaline surged into overdrive. Although the teaching was already in motion, the actual threat existed prior to Naruto. Therefore, if he dove to the side, the actual victims would be behind him. Because he was vigilant and nimble, he could also barely handle the motion. However, those behind him weren't. For some reason, he continued to blink even in the midst of everything. And two images flashed behind his eyelids at the same time. First, the group of young women behind him. 2. His father, whose face was indistinguishable and who was carrying a piece of paper that Naruto couldn't recognize. Naruto's eyes widened. The window of chance was narrowing, and the kunai were still pouring. Naruto then lifted his arms in front of his face. I apologize, Dad. Naruto thought, no, today. Something surfaced. As the Naruto friend gazed at his opponent, he felt a wave of inaccuracy. I'm not going to say. A buddy of mine said anything bad about your family technique, and I'm not going to say anything bad about your heritage, but I think we both know that you aren't the one I should be fighting right now. This was the last match of the freestyle rankings, and Choji was standing on wobbly legs. He had been bruised all over his belly while he was being expanded, and now that he was half as big, he was just as bruised. And he was definitely dead on his feet, but at least he was upright because Naruto was in the hospital, and Choji's thoughts of his opponent, who had been so strong and honorable, were sufficient to keep him upright. He felt that if he started taking it easy now, he wouldn't be much of a human being because he had fought hard and prevailed against Naruto. I can burn you down. Your spirit art won't protect you from non-physical damage like heat. Give up, said Naruto buddy, who kept staring at the big lad. Your technique, it's incomplete, and mine. Mine isn't, he said, putting his hands together in a tiger seal. Not today, said Choji, gritting his teeth. A friend of Naruto nodded. The match was initiated by the instructor. Choji plummeted into a fireball. Naruto believed that the Nine Beast was at least useful for something. It helped him leave the hospital before he had to endure any more of the dreadful thing they called food. Choji had been placed in the bed next to him, and he had eaten despite the other boys' possible distress over the meals. Choji had explained that it was customary to never throw away edible food. Even if Naruto was ready to contest the notion of edible. Nevertheless, Naruto sighed. Whatever the case, it didn't matter. He desired success, victory, a good grade, and, simply put, he had lost despite having made a great effort. He didn't blame Choji. If it had been a straight-up bout, Naruto would have taken advantage of Akimichi's weakness and been fresh to compete for the top slot. However, Choji was also swept up, and the crowd was responsible for the fight's outcome, which was a conflict of clans and willpower. However, it made little difference because he had already lost, and his injuries were so bad that they would delay the next freestyle rankings. He also couldn't win the normal rankings without his seals. And that was really the worst part. For him, getting a decent grade was extremely important, and it was incredibly difficult. When it all came down to it, he had to work and scrape for a shot, but something went wrong and he was unable to handle it. In contrast to his father, God, his dad was incredible. Every year, he won Rookie of the Year, received straight A's in topics that weren't even on the core curriculum, graduated at the age of 10, and was the type of genius that only comes along once every generation. How was that intended to be handled by Naruto? How could he have made such a person feel proud? He might have thought that if he could get off to a strong start, but now, it seemed unthinkable. Naruto's attitude darkened with each step as he walked towards the trees behind the academy. Since it was a Sunday and there was nobody else around, that was perfectly acceptable to him. He grunted as he shattered the cast on his right arm on the rough wooden exercise log. Then he fractured the left. His hand stung a tiny bit. However, they weren't all that awful. The Nine Beasts. The fucking Nine Beast. So strong, yet such a hindrance to anything he ever desired. And Naruto had the power locked up inside of him. He was siphoning a tiny bit, which supported his healing and his already high level of core energy, which was already high for Uzumaki. And he remained so weak. He lived his life in this manner. Find point A, find point B, and then work from here to there, regardless of how distant there was. But could he this time? And if he had to put forth so much effort to earn the, would it really matter? Naruto started punching the wood with his recuperating hands out of rage and a desire to get stronger. Naturally, it hurt, but not too much. He needed to take action. He simply had to. It was only him, his slight discomfort, and the steady thumping sound of training, so he kept punching the wood. It calmed him down a little. However, not entirely. After some time, he heard a quieter sound coming from behind him. As if he were reading poetry instead, he turned to see a little statue of a green rabbit holding a small white card in its mouth. The thin white form of the bunny needed some text wrapping. Don't give up and get better soon. I understand that it's difficult when you don't, as much as you would like to. However, you're incredibly powerful and courageous. And you'll perform better the following time, I'm sure. Despite being printed, These straightforward phrases nonetheless managed to express heart. However, who would? And Naruto received his response when he turned the card over. We appreciate your protection. He had blocked the kunai for one of the girls. Oh. He picked up the small green bunny, looked at the card, and then looked at the log once more. Subsequently, he inhaled deeply and retreated one step, and gave himself a thorough examination. Murdo offered right away when the teacher asked for assistance with a test that needed to be handed back. He couldn't claim to know every student's name in the class, but he stuck his hand up first, so he was hired. He distributed them by going from seat to seat after sorting through them. When he bent over her to put the paper on her desk rather than giving it to her, Hinata made an effort not to flush. She was unsuccessful. However, she was able to see what had been beneath his palm when he drew his hand away. He put a letter on her paper, and she recognized the little white card's shape. And she picked it up with shaking hands. I understand you, and I hope it's okay. May have preferred anonymity. I'll also attempt to remain anonymous. However, all I wanted to say was, you're welcome. And I simply wanted to express my gratitude. You described me as strong and brave, but I will be completely honest with you. Hinata glanced back hesitantly to see Naruto standing behind her, averted, and returning a paper to Shino in the corner. Hinata was shocked by how quickly her heart was beating. She doubted that it could tolerate such a rapid beating more than once in her lifetime, and that was right now. She shivered more as she flipped the card over. At the moment, I thought I had run out of courage. Additionally, you gave me enough money to help me get back on my feet. And I suppose what I'm trying to convey is that, if you ever need my assistance or a little boost of confidence, then simply come find me, and I'll assist you, I swear. P.S. Your writing is really unique and attractive. You need to work on your calligraphy or sealing skills. Breathing, and Naruto-kun, Hinata was so. When she closed her eyes, she could swear that she felt some of his strength seeping into her after holding the treasure firmly to her chest for a brief period. She exhaled tremblingly before carefully and securely tucking it into the pocket of her left jacket. She also made an effort to avoid blushing so much that she nearly fainted. She was unsuccessful. Naturally, Hayashi refrained from attacking his daughter when she got home from school, using only the precisely calibrated force and speed he expected her to overcome. Her first reaction required no such overcoming. Hinata eeped first. It was not very respectable for a Hyuga. Then, requesting that he wait, she scurried away from his attack and used her Byakugan on her first attempt. Hayashi continued. As she begged him to put her belongings away, she made a U-turn and attempted to get past him. He was happy to conclude that surprise attacks appeared to somehow get beyond his daughter's hesitation because Hayashi didn't stop and she was performing better than normal. He had to allow her to put her belongings away, but she screamed that she would fight him in a minute, that she would fight him all day, and that she would fight him all week. Hayashi continued, striking directly over her left jacket pocket and toward her waist. And after frantically screaming, no, Hinata pushed her left index and middle fingers into his open palm, defying all he had ever believed to be true about her. She leaned forward to do so, flinging her waist and back into the blow. It was a full-bodied blow. She fractured both of her fingers, and her form was wrong. However, her core energy hit him so hard that it completely incapacitated his right hand. Even so, Hayashi continued to go forward. She had never come this far, but he refused to commend her, instead allowing them to see how far she could go. Using the same limited amount of strength, he lifted his left arm to attack. In practice, Hayashi could not perform Joken on his own daughter's head, so Hinata once again defied his expectations by gritting her teeth and throwing her forehead into the blow. This would be a catastrophic mistake against a Joken practitioner in a real fight. Then, using her right hand, Hinata reached up and dislocated Hayashi's wrist. At last, Hayashi came to a halt and gazed at his daughter with astonishment. She said she was sorry as she looked back at him in fear, regret, and desperation. However, she had to really put her belongings away. Okay, class. Today we're going to start in on sealing and begin to talk about the explosive tag. Murdo became alert immediately. With a handy chalk stick in hand, the teacher walked around in front of the class. Now, he continued, starting to draw a simple seal on the board. Seals are the language of the gods. Not exactly, Murdo said, more out of habit than anything else. And what are they, then? The instructor asked, pausing and raising an eyebrow at Murdo. The entire class turned with anticipation. Despite this, Murdo started to feel a little uneasy. Well, the gods are representatives of certain natural forces. They are avatars, and seals are. Sakura raised her hand and said, "Are you suggesting that seals are kind of godly?" No one was startled. Asking questions was pretty much Sakura's function in class. Sort of. More like, gods and seals are both kind of nature. Why? It's like, seals are like pictures of the gods, or their shadows, or a millionth of a god, or similar kinds of things. Sakura's hand immediately rose once more. Would you create a new god if someone created a seal that was a million times better? There was no hesitation. Well, sure, but it would have to stretch over the whole main continent, and be charged by enough core energy to summon every boss summon ever known. About 30 times each. Sakura explained, but you would actually make a god, meaning that you would have control over it. Forcing that much law together means that you're already controlling the god. So why hasn't anyone tried it before, despite the fact that it's really difficult? A pregnant pause occurred. The class started to believe that Naruto was unable to respond to the query. And lastly, they did, replied Naruto with a voice that wasn't suitable for school. They wanted to create the god of something pretty harmless. Unchanged. They were going to do it to prove the relationship of gods, seals, and nature so well that no one could argue anymore. It was going to be the biggest breakthrough in the natural sciences, philosophy, and religion ever. It was going to be powered by all 9 Biju. The seals were going to run underground, on tectonic plates, but it scared too many people, and they were wiped out. The Biju were separated, and the presence of more than 2 in a country became a reason to go to war. Sakura couldn't help but question, were they or? As the class drank this in, why died? Yes. Oh. It's awkward. After clearing his throat, the teacher interrupted, saying, I'm really impressed. Would you like to teach the class, Murdo? Murdo blinked. The teacher bought it by saying, I'll grade it and, it's extra credit. The grade hooked Murdo. The class erupted in front of him. The teacher whispered to him, from a practical standpoint, please, we want to lead into seal charging and explosive tag use. After giving this some thought, Murdo nodded. A seal's power is like filling up a bucket, Murdo explained, recalling his own lessons on the topic. The size of the bucket depends on the seal rider's skill, and the amount of water you put in depends on the amount of core energy you put in. Your knowledge of the seal also determines the number and size of holes in the bucket. In other words, if you want to charge a seal, you'll need to pour in water faster than it can pour out through the bucket's holes. Get it? Therefore, comprehension is crucial. Seals are made up of strokes, Murdo explained as he drew the stroke of moon, and each stroke represents something. Sometimes they represent more than one thing. To charge a seal you need to either understand the strokes that make up the seal, or have a special kind of seal that will basically do the understanding for you connected to the first seal. If seals are like laws or rules, then autoflow seals are like lawyers. They help you handle the law you don't understand, but they charge you a fee. Sakura raised her hand. Sakura asked, usually somewhere between 10 and 30%, but Murdo answered before she could. Sakura let her hand fall. After a few seconds, it soared once more. Of everything, said Naruto, it tends to mess with the integrity of the writing of the main seal, so the bucket would be smaller, and it leaves a larger hole in the bucket as well. Sakura's hand fell. Perhaps she should hold off on asking questions until after he finished speaking. He seemed incredibly perceptive. A lot of seals can't be auto-flowed, Murdo added, but the explosive tag can. Actually, the Hokage was part of the group that came up with it, so to charge it, just stuff core energy inside. It will then be primed and the kanji in the center represents the key thought to activate, Baku, or explode, or really anything that gives a sense of explodiness will be just fine. You should know it's not actually kanji in the middle. It's a complex array of seals that provide the autoflow, reformed and shrunk to form, Baku, for convenience. The seal crafter fee for the auto seal, really, is where 30% of the cost of these tags come from. By the way, 40% comes from the annoying process to check the level of strength and reliability of the tags. Since they all look the same and no one wants to get conned, then there's a 20% store markup, and only the last 10% of the cost actually pays for the time to write the exploding part of the seal. Well, the point is that explosive tags are a lot of work and cost, so make the best of them. But I think the big part of the problem everyone has is the whole idea of triggering with Baku. I mean, the way it's written. Even thinking, I don't want to think about Baku, will make the thing blow up so. And Naruto kept on instructing. On his way home that day, Murdo encountered something he hadn't anticipated seeing near the school gates. "Murdo pal," scowled Murdo. "What are you looking for?" A few objects fell at his feet, and his sole response was a pair of gentle thuds. Looking up, on guard, Murdo gazed down at the white fingerless gloves at his feet and asked, "What is this?" His sole response was, "Put them on." "There's no point, forget it," Murdo said after scowling at his classmate for a time before turning to face the island. "The loser," the friend of Murdo said, "will admit to the winner that they deserve to be #1 in the rankings." With a sardonic laugh, Murdo asked, "What does that mean?" "It's not as though you have authority over the rankings." "No, but the victor," the Murdo friend went on, "will be entitled to the top spot in the rankings." After giving this some thought and remembering how it had compared to the highest in school, Murdo asked his friend, looking tired, "What's in it for you?" The Aiha withdrew a page from his breast pocket and said, "The same thing as you. I have this piece of paper that tells me I'm the best." But, he gripped the sheet at the top, in the middle, and tugged. In before of Murdo's astonished eyes, it tore. "However, I don't have the right to go with it. I don't deserve it, yet, and it's not as if you and I have any use for a piece of paper." Yes, they had no one to whom they could show it. Murdo pulled out his own sheet of paper, and he fixed his gaze on a single line. "However, you're incredibly powerful and courageous, and you'll perform better the following time, I'm sure." He silently tucked the note aside. "They're dirty," Murdo grumbled as he picked up the gloves from the ground, put them on, and dusted them on his pants before starting to go around his companion. "You couldn't have just handed them to me." "I threw down the glove. I thought it was poetic," said a friend of Murdo, raising an eyebrow. "But I like writing on clean surfaces," Murdo said. "Then bring your own next time." Murdo let out a grunt. "I brought a brush too," a friend of Murdo acknowledged, "but I don't think you need it." As he studied his opponent's fluid step, Murdo scowled and remarked, "Of course, I'm an Uzumaki," and with a flick of his wrist, an ink brush appeared mysteriously in his writing hand. "I was born with a brush in my heart, ink runs through my veins," he added. Then Murdo pal grinned and said, "Then Uzumaki, you can write whatever you want." The gather on his left, the adhere on his right, bite, identify the gather with blood. "I want to write what I had today." And Murdo's friend's smirk turned into a full-fledged smile before he executed a brief kata that concluded with the phrase, "Come on, Uzumaki," which is not taught in the academy. "Don't rush me, Aiha. Tenten-chan. Come on," cried Lee. "What? I have to go to my part-time work, so stop it, Lee." "Get moving!" Two young men are fighting a long-delayed battle of youth and pride. Lee pulled. "What?" Tenten always wishes she had a Lee to English dictionary. However, she allowed herself to be pulled away. She was taller than the majority of the other girls in the big group gathered around two boys in a circle because she was in her final year of the academy. "What's happening?" Tenten asked out loud. "What's significant?" Upon hearing that, Murdo friend Kun and Murdo are fighting, a blonde on Tenten's left decided to respond. They didn't get to have it out when the freestyle ranking battles happened, since Murdo and Choji got into this odd macho contest. "What?" Tenten double-checked herself, thinking, a fangirl, oh god, and hoped she wasn't becoming a habit of saying, "Ha." A lot of fangirls, wait. Additionally, they were oddly silent, which she noted out loud as well. "Murdo friend Kun is amazing," Ino observed gravely as she glanced over her shoulder at the brunette. "But Murdo, you should have seen him. At this point, we're just hoping no one gets too hurt." Tenten furrowed his brows. "Whoa!" Tenten-chan, can't you sense it?" shouted Lee. The blazing force that radiated from them. The stress. The sense of impending doom, as though fate itself has come to bring this titanic conflict to a long-awaited end. Tenten regarded her friend Lee with suspicion. "Come on." Murdo completed writing his seals in the circle and assumed his well-known position, turning sideways and pointing his brush at his opponent in defiance. "Choji?" Murdo proposed. A friend of Murdo nodded. "All right. Then. On 3, 1, said Choji as he stepped forward tremblingly. Murdo stiffened. My friend changed positions. 2. The crowd as a whole held its breath. With the exception of Lee. He shouted about the young people. 3! Choji then hurried back into the mob at full speed. As it happened, Murdo and his companion had already erupted into action. In the midst of the crowd, there was a terrifying storm of kunai and shuriken clashing, and Nerda's friend was throwing 3 at a time while strapping an equipment pouch to each leg. Since he didn't have to reach for a pouch, Nerdo managed to keep up even though he threw 1 at a time. He had progressed from the bag system following the freestyle ranking battle. Tenten exclaimed, "Wow, that unsealed so quickly." Like a firecracker chain, the accompanying smoke that indicated certain ninja arts went off with regular cracks before completely merging into a single, continuous hum. A deflected kunai shot at Tenten's head, but she grabbed it and continued to stare while others backed away from the altercation. "Unbelievable," Tenten murmured. One flew at the blonde girl retreating away to her left. She grabbed it, and still didn't look away. She refused to turn away. He was reckless and only threw 1 thing at a time, but for single throwing, he was as quick as sin while maintaining the edge and force that it represented. Nerda's companion, not expecting him to be very good at range, and he wasn't. So, on the average, Nerdo's friend was only doing slightly more minor damage than Nerdo was doing to him. According to his friend Nerdo, he never ran out of anything. The Nerdo friend didn't really need to run out, so that was okay. A final kunai was hurled in as his left hand tugged violently at the empty air as his comrade rolled to the side and then tumbled backwards. And Nerdo cursed as he noticed the glimmer of spider-like threads rising from the floor in the afternoon sun. Following him, the kunai behind him were drawn up. In response, Nerdo lost no time in rolling forwards. His left hand swept out behind him at the conclusion, and his right formed a half seal. Behind him, the steel was hurled away in a shower of fire and shattered steel. "Well, a tag that explodes ? Can already use them properly," Tenten cried. "They're still not used by the majority of people in my year." The pinkette ducked behind her and whispered absently, "Of course he can use them," focusing on the fight. "He taught the class for it," she said. A buddy of Murdo started to form hand seals. Murdo, once again, turned away from his pal, and, in 2 puffs of smoke, he had a second brush in his offhand and a sheet of clear paper in front of him. Monkey, ram, serpent, the mark of the stability, with his right hand, while he carefully drew on the paper in midair, the stroke of the inverted everything, with his left, boar, horse, tiger, a fireball, the diameter of either child, flew over the clearing, the mark of the transpose, with his right hand, flowing into the trigger, and the stroke of the swallow, with his left. Murdo then slid beneath the falling paper in midair, climbing up behind it and pushed it into the encroaching fire from behind. And Gakyaku was eaten in a flurry of flame and ember. No one said anything as an ordinary paper slid on the floor. All words were too weak in the light of this moment. And while resealing his brushes, Murdo gazed at his companion in the battlefield. My friend Murdo looked back. And the two began their dash at one another simultaneously, like though a signal had gone off. They collided in a rush of feet and fists in the center of the clearing. Murdo's companion was careful of Murdo's left hand, which had the blood gather. He knew well how Murdo had utilized it efficiently in the ranking fights. So he suffered a few hits from the right instead, but made care to circle around the left and delivered damage to Murdo's midsection. Murdo was sent reeling back against a foe with greater Thai spirit art. However, he grinned when his friend Murdo moved closer to him. When Murdo threw out his hand, a piece of paper flew at his friend's head in a puff of smoke. When his pal flinched, he jerked his body back in a desperate attempt to avoid touching the plain sheet. Consequently, the sheet blew in the wind and headed for the audience, who let out an unrestrained shout before someone saw that, well, it had nothing written on it. Murdo rose up, still grinning, and raised his left hand, bringing the middle and forefinger together. A friend of Murdo gave him a dubious look. Murdo glanced downward. Additionally, a friend of Murdo flicked his eyes down due to a negative emotion. From beneath his feet, a piece of discarded paper that was composed of the words, the inverse everything, the stability, the swallow, the transpose, and the trigger, appeared. Shit, swore the Aiha. Murdo unsealed what had been eaten with a flick of his fingers. And a ball of flames engulfed Murdo's pal.